My daughter-in-law started renovating my house with my money until I cut off every dollar overnight. It was the first time I'd ever seen my own father's face crumble like that. Not over a business deal gone south, not over Mom's illness, but over a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon and a few words spoken in my sunroom. He'd always been a man of granite, steady and unshakable, the kind who could stare down a boardroom full of sharks without blinking. But looking at him then, seeing that flicker of panic, that raw vulnerability, I knew something had shifted irrevocably. He'd asked me, voice tight with a desperation I'd never heard before, if I had any idea where Sarah might have gotten the funds for the extensive remodeling she was suddenly undertaking at our family estate. The estate, our home, my inheritance. And the chilling truth was, I did. Or rather, I had. It was my money, channeled through a trust fund that was supposed to be for future generations, a phrase that suddenly tasted like ash in my mouth. The house itself, a sprawling colonial in the rolling hills of Vermont, had always been the silent, magnificent centerpiece of our family's existence. It wasn't just a house, it was a legacy, a meticulously preserved monument to my father's success and my mother's gracious hosting. Every antique rug, every perfectly placed piece of porcelain, whispered stories of gatherings, holidays, and generations of tradition. It was the kind of place that made you feel small and important all at once, a feeling I'd grown up with, a feeling I'd always assumed would be my birthright. Until Sarah. Sarah. My son David's wife. We'd liked her at first, of course. Who wouldn't? She was charming, bright, ambitious, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and command attention without trying. She'd swept David off his feet, and for a while it seemed like a perfect match. They were the golden couple, the next generation poised to inherit the gilded life. I'd poured myself into welcoming her, into sharing the history and the significance of the estate, into making her feel like she was already part of the fabric. I'd told her the stories of my grandmother's rose garden, the hidden study where my grandfather wrote his memoirs, the ballroom where my parents had their wedding reception. I'd even entrusted her with the keys to the wine cellar, a privilege few were ever granted. The renovation plans had started subtly. A new coat of paint in the master suite, upgrading the kitchen appliances. Innocent enough, I thought. David had always been a bit of a dreamer, easily swayed by Sarah's persuasive charm. He'd assured me it was all just sprucing things up, making it their own. I'd nodded, a little uneasy, but chalking it up to newlywed enthusiasm. Then it escalated. Suddenly, the entire West Wing was slated for a complete overhaul.
Architects were sketching plans, contractors were milling about, and Sarah, radiant and a little flushed with purpose, was overseeing it all. She spoke of expanding the master bedroom, creating a state-of-the-art home theater, even adding a greenhouse off the conservatory. It was ambitious, extensive, and utterly overwhelming. And the money? Where was the money coming from? David's career, while promising, wasn't exactly flush with that kind of capital. He was an associate at a competitive law firm, working long hours for a respectable salary, but not that respectable. I'd asked David, gently at first. "Sarah's got some family money, Mom," he'd said, a little too quickly. "Her uncle left her a nice inheritance. She's always wanted to do this." I'd accepted it, though a tiny seed of doubt had begun to sprout. Sarah's family was comfortable, certainly, but not that comfortable. Not enough for a multi-million-dollar renovation on a property that wasn't even technically hers. The real unraveling began at Thanksgiving. It was always our grandest event, the house buzzing with family, laughter, and the comforting scent of roasting turkey. My siblings, their children, my cousins, the usual throng. Sarah, naturally, was the picture of a perfect hostess, gliding through the rooms, ensuring everyone had a drink, a smile, a warm word. She was a master of appearances. But this year, there was a new tension in the air, a subtle shift in the dynamics. The renovations, now in full swing, had transformed parts of the house into a controlled chaos. Tarps covered antique furniture, ladders snaked up walls, and the echoing thud of hammers was a constant, intrusive soundtrack. My father, usually the life of the party, seemed subdued. He kept glancing towards the new construction, his brow furrowed. During the lull after dessert, as the younger generation drifted off to watch football, Sarah cornered him. I was in the adjoining library, ostensibly looking for a book, but my ears were tuned to their hushed conversation. I couldn't make out the words, but Sarah's tone was undeniably insistent, and my father's posture, usually so upright, seemed to shrink. When he emerged a few minutes later, his face was pale, and he waved me over to the sunroom, away from the lingering guests. That's when he asked me, Do you have any idea where Sarah is getting the money for all this?" His voice cracked on the last word. I hesitated. The truth, the part of it I knew for certain, felt like a betrayal. I'd been authorizing payments, large recurring payments, from a specific trust fund account, my own, ostensibly for the upkeep and enhancement of the estate. I'd set it up years ago, envisioning a buffer for future repairs, for landscaping, for those unforeseen expenses that come with owning a property like this. I'd never imagined it would be emptied on a gilded cage, a personal Xanadu for my daughter-in-law.
The reason I'd been doing it, the secret I'd been keeping, was a pact I'd made with my father after my mother's death. He'd been lost, adrift, and I, in my own grief and a desperate need to hold on to something, anything, had stepped into a more managerial role. He'd entrusted me with a significant portion of his finances, including the control of that specific trust fund, with the understanding that I would manage it wisely for the family's benefit. When Sarah had expressed her grand vision for the house, David had come to me, pleading. Sarah felt stifled, he'd said. The house was too old-fashioned, too mom's. She needed space, light, a place that reflected her modern sensibilities. He'd painted a picture of Sarah's unhappiness, of the strain it was putting on their marriage. And I, in my well-intentioned but ultimately misguided attempt to smooth things over, to prevent another rift in my already fractured family, had started discreetly funneling funds. I'd told myself it was for the house, for our house, but I'd known, deep down, that it was for Sarah and for David, to keep the peace. "Dad," I started, my voice barely a whisper, the words catching in my throat. I've been helping out." He looked at me, his eyes wide, searching. "Helping out? With what, honey? That's a fortune she's spending." I couldn't meet his gaze. The sunroom, usually so bright and cheerful, suddenly felt oppressive, the sunlight filtering through the glass like a harsh spotlight. "The trust fund," I finally managed. "The one for the estate. I've been authorizing some significant expenditures from it, for the renovations." His face went from pale to ashen. He sank into one of the wicker chairs, the springs groaning in protest. "The estate fund? But that's meant for preservation, for the future, not for this." His voice trailed off, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the manicured lawn. The implication hung heavy in the air. "You've been letting her spend my inheritance on her whims." He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. The silence that followed was far more damning. It was a silence born of disbelief, of a profound sense of betrayal, not just by Sarah, but by me. He'd trusted me. He'd given me control, believing I would be its guardian. And I had, in essence, handed the keys to the kingdom to someone who saw it as her personal playground. I thought it was for the best," I stammered, my voice thin and reedy. "David said Sarah was unhappy. She wanted to make her mark. I thought it would create harmony." My father finally turned his gaze back to me, and it was like looking into the abyss. There was a deep, hollowed-out sadness there, a disillusionment that cut me to the bone. "Harmony?" he repeated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Honey, you've just bought her a ticket to do whatever she pleases, with our money, in our home." He stood up then, his movements stiff, weary. He walked over to the window and looked out at the sprawling grounds, the grounds he had worked his entire life to build and maintain. He seemed to be looking at something that was no longer his, something being systematically dismantled and rebuilt in someone else's image. "I don't understand," he said, his back to me. "Why wouldn't she just ask me? Why all the secrecy? Why would you go along with it without discussing it?" The questions hung in the air. unanswered. I had no defense. I had been so focused on averting one crisis, I had created a far greater one. I had tried to control the narrative, to manage the family dynamics with a heavy hand, and in doing so, I had lost control entirely. I had become complicit in the very thing I had tried to prevent, a feeling of exclusion, of being sidelined in my own family, in my own home. Later that evening, after the last of the Thanksgiving guests had departed, leaving behind a lingering scent of pine and a residue of unspoken tensions, I found Sarah in the grand ballroom, perched on a ladder, admiring a section of freshly plastered wall. David was beside her, beaming, holding a glass of champagne. The air in the room was thick with dust, the once gleaming parquet floor covered in protective sheeting. "It's going to be incredible, Mom," Sarah said, her voice bright, oblivious to the storm that had just erupted. David's father seemed a bit concerned about the budget, but I assured him it's all under control. She winked at David, who squeezed her shoulder. "We're thinking of a full sound system built into the ceiling and a projection screen that descends from the molding. What do you think?" I stood there, watching them, a cold, hard knot forming in my stomach. They saw a renovation. They saw progress. They saw their future. I saw my father's heartbroken expression. I saw the erosion of everything I'd held sacred. I saw the truth. Sarah wasn't just renovating a house. She was renovating my family, using my father's money and my complicity to build her own empire, brick by expensive brick. And in that moment, standing there amidst the dust and the half-finished grandeur, I felt a primal shift within me, a silent, chilling vow. This wasn't about harmony. This was about something far more fundamental. This was about power. And I realized, with a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that I had the power to stop it all, to take it all back. The next morning, the air in the house was still and heavy, a stark contrast to the usual cheerful bustle of a post-holiday week. My father had left early, a stoic nod his only goodbye. David and Sarah were in their temporary quarters in the guest wing, where the renovation hadn't yet reached. I, however, was at my desk in the study, the same study where my grandfather had poured his life onto paper. The large, ornate mahogany desk felt different today, heavier, imbued with a newfound purpose.
Spread before me were documents, bank statements, and the online portal for the trust fund. My fingers, usually steady, trembled slightly as I navigated the system. I'd spent the night awake, replaying the conversation with my father, the look in his eyes, the silent accusations. I'd also spent it researching and digging and uncovering. The details of the trust fund were complex, but one thing was crystal clear. I was the sole administrator, and while there were guidelines, ultimate discretion, within legal bounds, rested with me. My initial decision had been impulsive, born of shock and a desperate need to rectify my mistake. But as the morning wore on, as I meticulously reviewed the authorizations, the transfers, the escalating amounts, a different emotion began to take root. It wasn't just about stopping Sarah's endless spending. It was about reclaiming control, about correcting a profound imbalance. Sarah had treated my family's legacy as her personal piggy bank, and I had allowed it. I had enabled it. But the power to authorize was also the power to revoke. I took a deep breath, the scent of old paper and leather filling my lungs. It was time to be the granite my father had always been, not the pliable willow I'd become. I began to type, my keystrokes firm and deliberate. I initiated a series of withdrawals, redirecting funds back to the primary holding account, effectively freezing the operational balance of the renovation trust. Then, with a growing sense of grim satisfaction, I drafted a formal amendment to the trust's beneficiaries, adding a clause that stipulated a rigorous, multi-stage approval process for any significant expenditures moving forward, requiring not just my signature, but that of my father and an independent financial advisor. It was designed to be a bureaucratic labyrinth, a wall Sarah would find impossible to scale. The notification emails pinged on my computer screen, one after another, confirming the transactions. The accounts were being defunded. The pipeline was being shut off. It felt powerful and terrifying. I knew the fallout would be immense. I knew Sarah would be furious. I knew David would be caught in the middle, forced to confront the reality of his wife's manipulations and my own quiet intervention. But the silence of my father's disappointment had been a far heavier burden to bear than any storm Sarah could conjure. I closed the laptop, the click of the lid sounding like a final pronouncement. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the sprawling grounds. The West Wing, shrouded in scaffolding and tarps, looked like a wounded beast. The sounds of construction had ceased with the dwindling of funds, leaving an unnerving quiet. I imagined Sarah, her meticulously planned schedule derailed, her vision interrupted. I imagined her confusion, then her anger. I knew she wouldn't understand. She would see it as a personal attack, a betrayal of the understanding she thought she had with me.
She wouldn't grasp the years of unspoken history, the weight of legacy, the subtle poison of entitlement. I went downstairs, into the heart of the house, the parts untouched by the renovation. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of lemon polish and old wood. The grand staircase, the one I'd descended on my wedding day, stood silent and imposing. The portraits of my ancestors watched from the walls, their painted eyes seeming to hold a quiet disapproval, or perhaps a dawning understanding. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, a hard-won peace born not of reconciliation, but of decisive action. I had stepped back from the precipice of complicity. I had chosen a side, and in doing so, I had set a fire that I knew would burn through the heart of my family. The question was, who would get burned the most? The silence in the house stretched for hours, a palpable entity that pressed in on me from all sides. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of shared peace, but the tense, loaded stillness that precedes an explosion. I had expected immediate fireworks, a furious outburst from Sarah, David storming in demanding answers, but nothing, just this suffocating void. I made myself tea, the simple ritual grounding me as I waited. My father had gone to his study, a place he retreated to when contemplating difficult matters, or when he simply needed to be alone with his thoughts. He hadn't said a word since our conversation in the sunroom yesterday, just a tight nod when I'd mentioned needing to handle some financial matters concerning the estate. He knew. He understood, implicitly, that I was taking action. The first sign of life came in the late afternoon. A shrill, piercing shriek from upstairs, followed by a crash. Then an enraged bellow, definitely Sarah's voice, laced with a fury I hadn't heard before. It was followed by David's deeper, more desperate tones, trying to placate her. I didn't move from the kitchen, my heart pounding a steady, deliberate rhythm against my ribs. I could almost feel the tremor of Sarah's rage resonating through the old timbers of the house. She was discovering the well had run dry. Minutes later, the sound of rapid footsteps descended the main staircase. Sarah appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, her face a mask of disbelief and incandescent fury. Her normally perfectly coiffed blonde hair was slightly disheveled, and her eyes, usually so bright and engaging, were narrowed, burning with a cold fire. She wore a designer athleisure set that probably cost more than my entire monthly grocery budget, a testament to her taste for the finer things, even in a state of utter disarray. "What did you do?" She spat the words out, each one a tiny shard of glass. David trailed behind her, his face a study in panicked helplessness. He looked like a child caught between his parents, but worse, because it was his wife and his mother. I met her gaze, my own expression carefully neutral, a mask I had perfected over years of navigating family politics. "I managed the funds, Sarah, as I'm entitled to." Her mouth opened, then snapped shut. She took a step forward, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "Managed? You froze them. The contractors just walked off the site, Mom. They said they haven't been paid in 2 days. The plumbing crew is threatening to sue. This is a disaster." "Mistakes happen," I said, my voice calm, unnervingly so. "Perhaps there was a miscommunication regarding payment schedules. I'll look into it." "A miscommunication?" she shrieked, her voice rising to a pitch that would shatter glass. "This isn't a miscommunication, you manipulative old bat. You did this on purpose. You've always hated me, haven't you? You've been waiting for an excuse to sabotage me." David finally found his voice, a strained whisper. "Sarah, please, don't. "Mom, what's going on?" I turned my gaze to David, my expression softening, but only just. "David, I made some adjustments to the way the trust funds are managed. There were discrepancies in the oversight. I felt it was necessary to implement stricter protocols to ensure the long-term integrity of the estate." Sarah let out a bitter, incredulous laugh. "Integrity? You're talking about integrity? You've been siphoning off money from the estate fund for years for your own frivolous spending, haven't you? Always buying those ridiculous designer clothes and taking those lavish trips. Now you want to control my renovations? You're jealous because I have taste and ambition, something you've clearly lacked your entire life." The accusation hung in the air, raw and ugly. For a moment, the carefully constructed neutrality wavered. My mother's expensive silk scarf, folded neatly on the counter beside me, suddenly seemed like a symbol of the life I had been privileged to live, a life she had sacrificed for. But I pushed the guilt down. This wasn't about my past spending. This was about her audacious appropriation of what was rightfully our family's. "Sarah," I began, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "my spending is my business, and it is paid for by me, with my own money earned through a lifetime of prudent financial management. Your renovations, however, were being financed with funds designated for the preservation and betterment of this estate. Funds you were bleeding dry without any thought for the consequences or for the legacy you were carelessly dismantling." She scoffed, crossing her arms, a defiant posture that looked more petulant than powerful. "Legacy? This house is a museum. It's stuck in the past. I'm bringing it into the 21st century, and I'm doing it with my uncle's money, a fact you conveniently forgot to mention when you were busy playing benevolent matriarch with Daddy's trust fund." David's head snapped up. "Your uncle's money? Sarah, you told me that was all gone."
"You said, 'Shut up, David,'" Sarah hissed, turning her venom on him. "This is between me and your mother. She clearly has an issue with me, and she's using this as her little power trip." "This isn't a power trip, Sarah," I said, my voice hardening with each word. "This is about accountability and about restoring balance. The funds have been redirected, and moving forward, any significant expenditure will require multiple approvals, including mine and your father-in-law's, and an independent financial advisor. So no, your renovations are not going to continue as planned, not without proper oversight and genuine necessity." Her face contorted, a flicker of genuine fear momentarily replacing the rage. She had been so sure of her control, so confident in her ability to manipulate the flow of money. My abrupt severance had clearly blindsided her. "You can't do this," she cried, her voice cracking. "David, tell her she can't just cut us off." David looked at me, his eyes pleading. "Mom, Sarah's right. The contractors, the materials, we've incurred significant debts. This is going to ruin us." I turned to him, my gaze steady. "David, the debts you're referring to are for renovations that were approved under false pretenses. You knew this wasn't sustainable. You knew Sarah's claims about her uncle's inheritance were vague at best. You let her convince you that draining the estate fund was the answer. You have a responsibility here, David, a responsibility to your family and to the legacy you're meant to inherit, and that means being honest, not just with me, but with yourself." He opened his mouth to protest, but I held up a hand. "I'm not going to let you both destroy this house and your financial future on a whim. The renovations are on hold, indefinitely. And as for the contractors, I will make a statement to the relevant parties that the funding for the project has been terminated by the estate's administration due to budgetary reevaluation. They will have to seek recourse from the party who authorized the original contracts, which was Sarah." Sarah's jaw dropped. "You wouldn't dare." "Try me," I said, the words a silken threat. "You wanted to make your mark on this house, Sarah. Well, you have. You have certainly made a mark. Now you and David need to figure out how you're going to live with the consequences. I suggest you start by having an honest conversation about where the money actually came from and where it's all gone." She stared at me, her eyes blazing, but there was a dawning realization of her predicament. The walls were closing in. The easy access to money, the unchecked freedom, had vanished. David, looking utterly bewildered and dejected, simply stood there, caught in the crossfire. "You're going to regret this," Sarah whispered, her voice low and menacing. "You think you've won? You haven't seen anything yet." She turned on her heel and stormed out of the kitchen, David scrambling to follow her, his pleas lost in the echo of her retreat. The following days were a tense, drawn-out affair. The silence in the house was no longer just uncomfortable. It was charged with unspoken animosity. Sarah and David remained sequestered in the guest wing, their movements a study in strained politeness when they encountered me or my father. The contractors, true to their word, had indeed stopped work, leaving the left wing a skeletal husk of scaffolding and exposed beams. The air was thick with the smell of damp plaster and dust, a constant reminder of the halted ambition. My father emerged from his self-imposed exile gradually. He would sit with me in the library, reading the newspaper, occasionally offering a quiet comment about world events, but never about Sarah or the renovations or my actions. It was a delicate dance. He knew I had done what was necessary. He had seen the same look of entitlement and reckless spending that had once driven his own father to despair. But he was also a man who valued peace, and the rift I had created was profound. I spent my days meticulously going through the estate's financial records, not just the trust fund I had directly managed, but all accounts related to the house. I wanted to understand the full scope of Sarah's actions, the extent to which she had burrowed into our finances. And that's when I found it. Tucked away in a folder labeled Personal Archives, DS, I found a series of invoices and purchase orders for custom-designed furniture, high-end appliances, and bespoke fixtures. They were addressed to Sarah's personal business entity, a small interior design firm she had technically dissolved years ago, but which I now realized was merely a shell for her private transactions. The amounts were staggering, and the dates, they corresponded precisely with the periods when I had been authorizing large sums from the estate trust. It became chillingly clear. Sarah hadn't just been spending money on the house. She had been using the estate's funds as a personal slush fund, funneled through her defunct business to fund her entire lifestyle, the renovations being just the most visible manifestation of her insatiable appetite. She had been creating a paper trail, albeit a flimsy one, that suggested these were legitimate business expenses related to the ongoing work. But the sheer volume and nature of the items purchased, personal art installations, designer home goods not even installed yet, even exorbitant travel expenses for material sourcing, painted a picture of blatant fraud. This was a revelation that went beyond mere financial imprudence. This was calculated deception. She hadn't just been taking advantage of my naivete and my father's trust. She had actively been trying to conceal her actions, to create a false narrative.
She had treated the estate, and by extension my family, not as something to be preserved or enhanced, but as a resource to be exploited for her own gain. Armed with this new information, I felt a cold resolve settle over me. My initial act of cutting off funds had been reactive, an attempt to stop the bleeding. Now it felt like a strategic maneuver, a prelude to a more comprehensive action. Sarah had shown her hand, revealing not just a disregard for our family legacy, but a willingness to engage in outright deception. One evening, a week after the renovations had ground to a halt, I found Sarah sitting in the main drawing room, a place usually reserved for formal occasions, not for quiet contemplation of financial ruin. She was staring blankly at a gilded mirror, her expression a mixture of defiance and wariness. David was nowhere to be seen. He had been spending more and more time at his office, trying to find some semblance of order in his professional life, I presumed. I entered the room, my footsteps deliberate on the antique Persian rug. Sarah flinched but didn't turn. "I found them," I said, my voice low and even. She slowly turned her head, her eyes narrowing. "Found what?" "The invoices, the purchase orders, addressed to Sarah Sterling Designs, the ones that detail your personal acquisitions, the ones you tried to pass off as renovation expenses." Her carefully constructed facade began to crack. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a sickly pale hue. "You think you can get away with this?" I continued, stepping further into the room. "Using my father's legacy as your personal ATM? Creating fake companies to funnel money into your own accounts? You have no idea the kind of trouble you've put yourself in, Sarah." She finally found her voice, a hoarse whisper. You can't prove anything." "Oh, I can," I said, a small, cold smile playing on my lips. "I have copies of everything. Dates, amounts, item descriptions. It's all there. The auditors will have a field day, and I've already consulted with counsel. They are preparing the necessary documentation. We will be pursuing legal action." The fear in her eyes was palpable now, a raw, naked terror that replaced the bravado. She finally understood the magnitude of her mistake. She had pushed too hard, stolen too much, and I, the quiet observer she had so carelessly underestimated, was about to make her pay. "Please," she stammered, her voice trembling. "Don't do this. I can explain. It got out of hand. I was going to pay it all back." "Pay it back with what, Sarah?" I asked, my voice devoid of sympathy. "With more of my father's money? Or perhaps you'll sell some of those delightful art pieces you acquired, the ones that aren't even installed in the house." She looked down at her hands, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. "David, he was going to handle it. He said we'd figure it out together."
David is your husband, Sarah. He is not your accomplice, nor is he your bailout fund, I stated, the words sharp and final. He has been living a lie, believing in your narrative. Now he has to live with the consequences of your actions, just as you do, and so do I. Because you've not only endangered yourself financially, but you've threatened the very foundation of our family. You've betrayed my father's trust, my husband's loyalty, and the sanctity of this home. I took another step closer, my gaze locked on her. The renovations are halted. The legal proceedings are in motion. You will be held accountable. And as for this house, this estate, it will be protected. And you, Sarah, will have no further access to it, or to its funds. Ever. I turned and walked out of the drawing room, leaving her alone with her fear and her rapidly unraveling reality. The silence that followed me was different this time. It wasn't the tense quiet of anticipation. It was the profound stillness of a battle that had been decisively won. But I knew this was just the beginning. The legal fallout, the family schism, the emotional scars, these would take time to heal, if they ever truly healed at all. I had stopped Sarah, but the cost, I suspected, was just beginning to become apparent. The door to the drawing room clicked shut behind me, a definitive punctuation mark on a chapter of betrayal and deception. The game had changed, and I, the quiet matriarch, had just declared war. The legal documents landed on their doorstep like a death knell, official and stark against the polished mahogany. Sarah's initial reaction was pure, unadulterated disbelief, followed swiftly by a tidal wave of panicked fury. I received a tear-soaked, breathless call from David a few hours later, his voice choked with a despair I hadn't heard even when his father was on his deathbed. He was incoherent, bouncing between accusations and pleas, demanding to know how I could do this. I listened, my face impassive, my heart a hard, cold stone in my chest. I told him, calmly, that I was merely upholding the law and protecting the integrity of the estate, a phrase that seemed to only further inflame his distress. He didn't seem to grasp the gravity of the fraud charges, the potential for jail time, the complete and utter ruin I had meticulously orchestrated. He was too busy grieving the life he thought he had, the effortless luxury he had come to expect. My father, bless his stoic heart, finally spoke about it the next morning, over a breakfast I barely touched. He didn't look at me directly as he said, his voice raspy with a pain that seemed to emanate from deep within him. "You've done what had to be done, Ilara. You've protected us. But at what cost?" He finally met my eyes, and in their depths I saw not just pain, but a profound, weary understanding. He knew the path I had chosen was a lonely one, paved with difficult decisions and the inevitable fracturing of family bonds. He understood that sometimes the only way to save what you love is to cut away the rot, no matter how painful the amputation. His acknowledgement, his quiet approval, was the only absolution I needed. Sarah, predictably, retreated into a fortress of denial and self-pity. Her lawyers, a team I had vetted extensively, were formidable, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. Every invoice, every purchase order, every bank transfer was a nail in her coffin. She tried to paint herself as a victim, manipulated by her own greed and a desperate attempt to maintain a lifestyle she felt entitled to.
She even attempted to leverage David to have him testify on her behalf, to claim the entire affair was a misunderstanding, a complex financial transaction he had no knowledge of. But David, shattered and exposed, refused. He had his own legal troubles to contend with, and his lawyer had advised him to cooperate fully with my investigations if he wanted any chance of salvaging his own future. He was a man broken, his dreams of an easy inheritance evaporated, replaced by the stark reality of his wife's deep-seated dishonesty and his own complicity by willful ignorance. The legal proceedings were swift and brutal. Sarah fought every inch, her desperation escalating with each setback. She accused me of fabrications, of hacking her accounts, of a personal vendetta disguised as justice. But the paper trail was irrefutable. The luxury goods, the exorbitant travel, the disguised shell company, it was all there, laid bare for the court. Her primary legal defense hinged on claiming the funds were in advance from her uncle's estate, a claim that crumbled when it was revealed her uncle's estate was modest and had been settled years ago, with no mention of any substantial bequest to Sarah. My own legal team, methodical and unyielding, presented the evidence of Sarah's deliberate misrepresentation, her fraudulent schemes to siphon funds designated for the preservation of our family's heritage. The shockwaves that rippled through our extended family were immense. My own siblings, distant cousins, even my mother's old bridge partners, all came calling, some with veiled accusations, others with open support. My Aunt Carol, a woman of sharp tongue and even sharper intellect, called me directly. "Ilara, darling," she'd said, her voice a gravelly whisper, "you've always been the quiet one, but it seems you have the steel of a Roman empress. I always knew there was more to you than met the eye." Her words, coming from a woman who had seen and done it all, felt like a profound validation. The final verdict was not a victory lap, but a stark, somber pronouncement. Sarah was found guilty of multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. The sentence was significant, a combination of restitution, community service, and a hefty fine that would undoubtedly bankrupt her. The luxury designer wardrobe, the extravagant art, the carefully curated lifestyle, all would be liquidated to satisfy the court-ordered repayment. David, through a plea bargain that minimized his own exposure, agreed to a substantial financial settlement and a period of probation. He would lose access to the estate's funds entirely, a consequence that seemed to crush him more than any legal penalty. He was, in essence, disinherited, stripped of the future he had always assumed was his birthright. The house remained. It stood, grand and silent, a monument to a legacy that had been threatened, but ultimately preserved. The West Wing, the site of Sarah's ill-fated renovations, remained a shell, a stark reminder of the chaos that had nearly consumed us. I ensured that the contractors who had been left unpaid received their due, a gesture of integrity that felt more significant than any celebratory champagne. The estate funds, now under my sole, ironclad control, were meticulously managed, invested with a foresight Sarah could never have comprehended. The aftermath was a desolate landscape. Sarah disappeared from public life, her name becoming a whispered cautionary tale. David, humbled and stripped of his pride, moved out of the state, seeking anonymity and a fresh start, though I doubted he would ever truly escape the shadow of his wife's actions and his own failures. Our family gatherings, once boisterous affairs filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses, were now smaller, quieter. The pretense of happy togetherness had been irrevocably shattered. The lingering tension, the unspoken resentments, the painful awareness of betrayal, these were the ghosts that haunted the rooms. My father passed away 2 years later, peacefully, in his own bed, surrounded by the quiet dignity of his lifelong home. He had seen me secure the estate, seen his legacy protected. In his final days, his grip on my hand was weak, but his eyes held a deep, unwavering trust. He knew I had done what was necessary. He knew I had fought for what mattered most. The house is mine now, entirely. The vast rooms echo with the footsteps of my solitude, but it is a solitude I have earned. I walk through the halls, touching the antique furniture, the walls that have witnessed generations of triumphs and tragedies. I see the faded portraits of ancestors who faced their own battles, their own moments of crisis. I am a part of that continuum, a guardian of a legacy that almost faltered. There are no grand pronouncements, no triumphant declarations, just the quiet hum of life continuing, a testament to resilience. The raw, visceral humiliation I endured early on has been replaced by a steely resolve. The silence that once suffocated me now feels like a sanctuary, a space where I can finally breathe. The control I have established is absolute, not out of a desire for power, but from a deep-seated understanding of responsibility. I have seen what happens when entitlement and unchecked ambition collide with heritage, and I will never allow it to happen again. Sometimes, late at night, I sit in my father's study, the scent of old books and polished wood filling the air. I look out at the moonlit grounds, the sprawling lawns, the ancient oaks that have stood sentinel for centuries. There is a profound sense of peace here, a quiet satisfaction that settles deep within my bones. I think of Sarah, of her avarice, her desperation, and the utter emptiness it ultimately led to. I think of David, lost in the wreckage of his own making. And I know, with an unshakable certainty, that I have survived. I have endured. I have protected what was entrusted to me, and in doing so, I have finally found my own true place, not as a pawn or a victim, but as the undisputed keeper of this legacy. The weight of it all is immense, but it is a weight I carry with pride, knowing that the future, for this house, for this name, is secure. The embers of betrayal have long since turned to ash, and in their place, a quiet, unyielding strength has taken root, deep and enduring, like the ancient trees outside.